Hey class, in this video we're going to be going over some basic user interface stuff with Godot. We'll be looking at making a Godot title screen or like a start screen, and then we'll add a couple UI scenes into the game that we already have. So this is going to be a little bit different setup wise. We're going to keep working with the lab that we started last week, and we're just going to add some new scripts in there. So I'll go over how to get started with that. We're also going to be adding some UI or user interface elements into the scene. So I'll give you guys a quick look at the art that I designed for these, and I'm going to go over how to put these in the project as well. There's a lot of different ways to do this. I went ahead and just like drew all of the buttons that I was going to use in the game rather than using text, just to kind of simplify things. I tend to like to have my own art as the UI for the project so that I'm not relying on the default of the engine, which, you know, people will be familiar with, so it'll be kind of recognizable. So I created a couple assets. I created all of the buttons that I'm going to be using. You can see I have the start game. I use the same button background. I have start game, quit button, instructions, play again, and then I have this blank button background with the layer that I used as a template. You could draw separate buttons for each one, however you want to go about it. So that's what I'll be using for the buttons, and I'm going to export this. Again, there's a lot of different ways to do this, but what you're going to want to have is each button on a separate file. The way that the GUI works, it's not like a sprite where we can add different files, and there's complicated ways to make that work, but to keep things simple, we're just going to export all the buttons by themselves. So I'll show you guys how to do that now with Piskel. So when I go to export, I have the scale at 2. You know, that's fine. The buttons I drew were kind of small, so I made them a little bit larger. You might want to scale yours up or down depending on how big they are. But normally we export a sprite sheet, which puts all of the frames into one button. We're actually going to want to go over to the zip, and we can actually download a zip file with all of the frames as individual images. So I'm going to make a prefix for this folder, and I'm just going to call this UI, capital U, capital I for user interface. I'm not going to check split by layers because I have multiple layers in my sprites and I want to keep those the same. And then I'm going to click download zip. And now we see I have this game buttons folder here. And you can see I have UI 0, 1, 2, 3, 4. So that fourth one I actually don't need. I could delete that if I wanted to. But the nice thing is I have it in a folder that I can drop directly into my sprites folder. So you want to make sure to have each one of those separately. And they don't necessarily have to be the same size. That's just the way that I designed them to kind of make things a little bit faster. You also don't have to draw by hand. If you want to use like a font or text for each button, you can do that as well to make it more readable. I like to draw things by hand just so everything is kind of fitting in the same style. So I have my buttons here. I could rename these if I want, but you can see what it says. So I'm just going to leave those as is for now. So I've got my game buttons. I also made a couple of other images to use for like the splash pages in my game. So I'll go back to Piskel and let's go back to my gallery. I made a Gameover just to show, you know, for now it'll just be when the user falls below the bottom of the screen. So I just made a little Gameover sprite. It's really simple. I just drew Gameover, and I kind of quickly drew it in to keep this kind of like sketchy look that I'm using. So I'm just going to export this as a PNG because it's just by itself. And that looks good. I kind of designed it to fit the size of the game that I have, but I think it's actually a little small, but that's okay. I'm just going to go with this. So I have my game over image along with my game buttons folder. So I have those there, and let's go back to my gallery. I also made a title for the game. I didn't spend a ton of time on this. I just drew some trees and some clouds just to, you know, give sort of a little bit of graphics, and then I just wrote my game. I didn't even give the game a real title. You guys obviously should give your game a title. So I'm going to export this. This is also at scale 2, so it's 500 pixels by 184. That'll definitely fit inside of my canvas, so that's fine. I'm going to just export a single sprite, but it's only one frame, so using sprite sheet will do that fine. So I have the game over, the game title, and then I have, keep losing my gallery. And then I have some instructions. Obviously, I didn't spend a lot of time on these instructions. I just kind of drew the arrows, jump, right and left. Pretty straightforward. You know, if your game has different buttons, you should include those buttons. But for now, our game is really simple. And so I just wanted to draw some instructions really quickly just to have that for the demo. So I'm going to download that sprite sheet as well. So now I have my sprites. I'm almost ready to get started. I need one more thing, which is on the lectures page as usual. I'm going to download some new scripts. So this week is a little bit different. We're not downloading a whole project. We're just going to download some updated scripts that we're going to put into the project. And so we're getting more used to Godot. We're going to start building more things from scratch. And so I'm not going to include just like a whole project, but we will be working with the projects that we've done in the past. So I'm going to end up duplicating lab 2 to create lab 3 and just adding some files in there. So I'm going to download the lab 3 archive. And on the Mac, it's going to automatically unzip it for me. And you can see all it is a scripts folder. So we're just going to replace the scripts folder that we have in our other project with that one. So that way it'll overwrite the scripts that we already have, as well as adding this new start menu script, which we'll go over. If you're on Windows, you might have to extract it yourself. Just make sure that you have the scripts folder with the 3 scripts that matches what you have in the project folder. If you have any issues with that, let me know. We can go over it on Discord. So I'm going to go to my MMP 270 project folder. I have this lab 2. This is where I'm going to put stuff. I'm going to make a duplicate copy of this so that I'm not overwriting things. But you could probably just throw your stuff in here. It kind of depends on how you want to do it. If you're not worried about losing stuff, just like throw the scripts in there and start from there. If you are, go ahead and just duplicate it. So on Mac, I can hit Command D. I can also right click and go down to duplicate. On Windows, you have to do copy and paste. I don't think there's a duplicate option. So I'm going to just rename this guy to, oops. So I'm going to go to rename and we're going to call this lab 3. And we're going to make some changes in this folder before we actually open Godot. So hopefully you guys can see this. Maybe I'll zoom in a little bit. So the first thing that I want to do before I even bring in my other files from over here, I'm going to zoom in a bit. Okay, so the first thing that I want to do is I want to make sure that my project is organized well. So I'm going to take this lab 3. I'm going to make a new folder in here and call this scenes. I'm going to be adding a bunch of scenes today. So now you can see we have a scripts folder, a sprites folder, and now a scenes folder. So we're not just like throwing a bunch of stuff into the main project folder. And so I'm going to put my existing scenes in here. This is going to create a couple of issues when we open the project, but it's actually a good chance for us to look at some of the default project settings. So anything that has .tscn at the end is going to go in my scenes folder. All of the stuff out here, I'm going to kind of ignore. As long as I have my default environment, that's the settings, and my project.godot, that's everything that the Godot editor kind of needs to be able to find. Everything else is going to go in these new folders. So now that I have my folders set up, I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to move my scripts folder into here. It's going to say there's already a folder, and do I want to replace it? I'm going to say yes to replace, and that's going to update my scripts. You could also drag them over one by one, however you want to do it, but we just want to make sure to update those scripts there. And then finally, I'm just going to drag my new sprites over to my sprites folder. So I'm going to drag the game buttons as one folder so they're easy to find. And then I could create more folders here if I want, but I don't really have that many images. So I'm just going to drag these 3 guys over. Maybe I'll put game in front of this one so that they all have the same title scheme, so they'll be easy to find. I'm going to drag those in there. Then I'm just going to delete these zip files, keep my downloads folder nice and clean. And now I'm ready to actually get started with editing the project. So we are going to get a couple errors since we move stuff around when we open the project, and that's a good chance for us to go over how to address some of those. So when I click project.godot, it should open it up. That doesn't seem to work on Windows because you have to like actually tell the Windows program like what the where the editor is. But if you set that up, it'll work, or you can just open Godot first and then open the project. So you can see I have this alert that the main scene file is moved or deleted. So Godot expects there to be a main scene file there. Since we moved main scene into the scenes folder, it's going to have a problem here. So I'm just going to hit OK. And the way that I'm going to fix that, and this is a good time to kind of go over how this works, is I'm going to go to project and go to project settings. There's a ton of settings under here. And under application, there's a run section, and that actually decides what the main scene is. You can see the default is this main scene.tsn. And it doesn't know where that is anymore. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to click on this folder. I've got to zoom out a little bit. Go into scenes and then choose main scene.tsn. I'm going to hit open. And so that's going to fix that issue. So now if I build the project, it should open that main scene. I guess I'd need to have this scene open. Oh, sorry, I forgot to go over this other error. So the other problem it has is that it can't find the player because we moved the player scene as well. And so when you get an error like this, you can click on it first. Okay, we have to tell it what we want to click, and we're going to click Fix Dependencies. We can see this player.tsn is missing. It expects it to be on the main folder, but we can find it. We just click the folder button, go to Scenes, choose the player scene, and click Open, and then click OK. And this should be fixed now. So now I can go to Open anyway. And now if we zoom in on our scene, everything looks good. Our player is still there. So we can save this and then build the scene. And everything's working normally. So this looks fine. So if you went through all those steps and you still have some issues, let me know. We can go over it on Discord. But now we have everything nice and organized, and we can continue working on the project. So we're going to get into the graphical user interface system in Godot. It's quite complex. There's a lot of different stuff that you can do with it because there is a lot of UI that needs to happen in a game to make it usable. We're going to kind of start slow. We're just going to go over some of the basics. And so we're going to start by making a new scene that is a UI scene. It's called, in Godot, it's called a control scene. And so we're going to make a new control scene, and we are going to add in some basic buttons there. So this part we're actually doing from scratch. So since we've been using the Godot editor a bit this semester, hopefully we're a little bit more familiar with things. So we're going to start doing a bit more in these labs. I'm going to quickly make this guy a little bit smaller because I'm going to be in the way. Some stuff. I'm still getting used to using OBS, so bear with me. I'm just going to make this a bit smaller so I don't cover up too much of the editor. Okay, so let's keep going. So we're going to add a start scene, and then we're going to change that to make that the main scene that we open the page on. So to do that, I'm going to go to my scenes folder and go to new scene. This is how I'm going to add new scenes. And I'm going to call this start menu and click OK. And so this is going to be a user interface scene. You can see it has like a little green button here. So I'm going to click user interface, and that gives me this like control node. And then I'm going to save that, and now it shows up in our scenes menu. So for the other user interface scenes, I'm probably just going to duplicate this, but this is how you create a scene from scratch. So then with the user interface, you'll notice that it looks a little bit different. We have this control node that has like a layout, and right now it's set to full rectangle, so it's going to fill up the whole screen. And so you can just kind of like throw stuff onto the screen and move it around like we did with the game. But we're going to go over a little bit of a better way to approach designing the user interface. And I'll explain why real quick. So I'm going to turn on my drawing tool. So right now, imagine we have a game that looks like this, and it's 1024 pixels by 512 pixels. And let's say, we're not going to build this today, but let's say you have, down here, you have a health bar. Okay, so it's like right here, you have a health bar here, and up here you have like a number of lives that you have left. So let's say you have 3 lives. And let's say you also have like a button in the middle of the screen that says start. So this is all the UI. It doesn't actually like move around the scene. It stays in one place. And so if we design it with the assumption that our screen is 1024 by 512 pixels, that's fine as long as you build the game and distribute the game in that format. But let's say you allow players to make the game full screen or to make a wider window, and then suddenly the window changes and it looks like this all of a sudden. And it's, it goes wider this way and wider this way. If our UI is just stuck right here and right here, all of a sudden it's going to be in the middle of the screen, which is not where we want it to be. We want it to be anchored down here or over here. And we want this to be centered, regardless of where it is on the screen. And so with the Godot layout system, we can make sure that regardless what the screen size is, that it'll always look like that. So with the layout system, we can choose to anchor things to different places, to center things, or to make it take up the full screen. And so we're going to start with the full rectangle, and then we're going to add some elements in bit by bit. So there's a ton of different things that we can do. I'm just going to go over some of the basics. So we're going to start with our start screen, and I'm going to add a couple things in here just right from the beginning. So one thing that I want to have is like the title image. Okay, so I'm going to add a texture, and I'm going to kind of go through this and kind of move things around to different places. So under our canvas items, you can see the control items, and there's a whole bunch of stuff in here. You guys should look through all those. I'm just going to type in what I want just to make things a little bit faster. So right now I'm looking for a texture, and I want a texture rectangle. So that's just like a sprite, but for the UI. And I'm going to click create. And you can see that it's like sticking it up here. I'm going to choose my texture. So I'm going to go down here and go to load, go to sprites, and find my game title. Click open. Oh, and I always forget to do this. Whenever you have new sprites, just make sure to go in and change the import turn off filter if you're using pixel art. If you're not using pixel art, don't do this. But if you're using pixel art, the filter is going to make them look kind of weird because they're supposed to have hard edges. We don't want them to be kind of softened around the edges. Okay, so I'm going to turn the filter off for all of those. Okay, so with the default texture rectangle, we can see that it's stuck to the upper left corner. I can preview the scene, but just by clicking on the scene button. That's not really where we want it, right? So I can go to layout and I can center it. So now that looks a little bit better, but we're going to put some elements in here, and we want the layout system to be able to kind of put the elements relative to each other. You don't have to design your scene to look exactly like how I'm designing it, but I'm just going to go over some basics to explain how different things work. So what I'm going to use is called a vertical box to arrange the elements. And what a vertical box does is it basically just divides up your space between some different elements. So we're going to do that, and then we're going to put our elements in there. So I'm going to go to control, I'm going to add a child node, and I'm just going to type in VBox. You can see it's a container. It's kind of like HTML works in a certain way if you've done any HTML stuff. So I'm going to put my texture rect in the VBox, and you'll see it's going to now change the alignment. So anything that's inside of another control structure no longer has its own anchor. I can't change the layout here anymore. With the VBox, I can change the layout. So I'm going to center this. Okay, and so I'm going to add a couple more elements in here. And so now I'm going to add in some of my buttons. And adding a button is a little bit tricky. So let's go in and just add a button first. So there's regular buttons, but we want our button to have a graphic. So we're going to use a texture button down here. So I'm going to add a texture button, and then we need to make sure to name these buttons. I have a script that we're actually going to add to the control node. And when we look at that script, the start menu script, it has specific names for the buttons. So you can change these buttons or do different things with them, but if you don't want to change the script, then you need to use the right name. So I'm going to use this as a reference. So my first button is the start button. It's going to start the game. So I'm going to save that. Oops, that was actually my texture rect. I want my texture button, so I want my start button. And let's actually name this texture rect so I don't edit it by mistake. So let's get our start button and we're gonna go to textures. You can see here, something that's kind of cool is you can actually have different textures for all of your different states. So if you wanna, spend a little bit more time designing the button in Piskel, you could actually do a whole bunch of different states with like different colors and hover states and stuff like that and throw them in there. So let's go to load and go to sprites. And this is gonna be inside my game buttons. This is the start game. I'm gonna click open. So one thing you'll notice immediately is that the button is not centered. And that's a funny thing with the UI is that because this button is inside of another layout, I can't actually tell it to be centered. But what I can do is add a center node. So the way I do that is I just add a child node and I type in center. And so I'll get a center container. And this is kind of like a special little container that just does that one thing. So that's gonna center my start button. So the layout system works a little bit weird. There's like different context for things. Because we're in the VBox container, we can't affect our own layout, but we can use this other container to center our button. So that looks pretty good. So once I get that looking the way I want, I'm just gonna duplicate this a couple times. And so I'm gonna start with my start button and I'm going to, I'm gonna go to the next button. And so this will be, whoops. So I'm gonna rename this instructions button. And let's make sure that matches the script. Yep, that looks right. And then our next one is the quit button. So then let's grab the textures to make sure that looks right. So that's obviously a different texture. So let's go to sprites, game buttons. This one is for instructions. So I'm gonna click open. And then we'll grab this guy and load the quit button. And so all that code is already written for you. I'll show you in a second how that is set up in case there's some issue and you want to try to reset something. Or if you want to have other buttons, you could explore doing that. And you don't necessarily have to have all the buttons that I have, or even like the same exact start menu. I'll go over some different options for that, but I'm just doing a few basics that you might see in a basic game. So now this isn't centered really. So what I want to do, go back to my VBox container. I'm gonna click center. There we go. So that looks pretty good. I'm gonna preview my scene. And that looks pretty good. You might, say, actually, let's move these guys over here and move this over here. You could do different things with this layout, but this is pretty good. I'm pretty happy with this. So I'm gonna quit this for now. So that's pretty good to start with my start menu. I have the code already set up, so this should actually work. If I play the scene and click start game. Oh, no, it doesn't work. So we're actually gonna have to set up our signals. So even though the code is already there, I forgot we're gonna have to turn on our signals anyway. So I was gonna go over this, but now we really have to go over it. So to get these guys connected to our code, we have to set up what's called a signal. And if it has a signal, you'll see a little icon here. So I should have realized that there weren't built-in signals. So the way to add a signal, first thing I want to do is make sure that the action mode is set to button release. If you do it as button press, it'll do the action as soon as the user hits the button. A typical or more typical experience is that the action happens after we release the button. So that says button release, that's good. I think everything else is fine. So then we go over to the node panel here. And so you can see there's a few different events, button down, button up, and pressed. There's also toggle. There's a bunch of stuff down here as well. We're just gonna double click pressed. And we're gonna click on control. Oh, we don't have the script yet. So whoops, forgot that this is not a template. So we need to add our script first. So we're gonna go to script. First, I'm gonna select the control node, the main node of the scene. I'm gonna go to the script and load script, go to scripts and go to start menu and click open. And even though it says start menu, I should have just named this menu because it actually is gonna be the code for all of our menus. Okay, so now that I have that script connected, I'll go back to my start button, go back to the node, double click pressed. And here we have on receiver method on start button press. So that's exactly what we want. It did a pretty good job of finding that in the script because it was written that way. So I'm going to click connect, and then we can see the code, what actually happens when we click the start button. It's going to load the main scene, which is what we want. And you can see now there's that little signal icon. So we know that's connected. So now we can actually try this out. I'm going to preview the scene. So if I click start game, we start the game. So not too bad. There's a little bit of setup that goes into it, but now we can actually give the user some controls over the game. I probably want to redesign this level soon. We'll do a level design lab pretty soon. So I'm going to close that and save. So let's connect our next two buttons. So I just go to instructions button, go to node, double click pressed. It already found this method, so I'm just going to click connect. And this is going to change the scene to instructions. That doesn't exist yet, so we're gonna make that next. And then finally we have the quit button. I'm going to double click pressed and choose on quit press. That looks good. Click connect. You can see this here says get tree, which is like the main sort of game data structure, and then it just says .quit. So that's pretty straightforward. It's just going to quit the game. Nothing really exciting there, but that's good. That's our start menu. So let's make our instructions menu, and then we'll put another menu inside of the game. So the way I'm going to make my instructions menu is actually just to duplicate my start menu and change a couple things, just to make things a little bit easier. So I'm going to go down to my project, click on the start menu and go to duplicate. And I'm going to rename this instructions. And actually I just called it instructions in the code. So I'm just going to call it instructions. Oops, I made a script by accident. Didn't want to do that. So let's delete that. Go to scenes, start menu, and duplicate, and this is instructions. So I'm going to change the layout a little bit in instructions. So make sure you're not editing start menus because they look the same at the moment. So we can close start menu, go to instructions. So for the instructions, we're going to first want to change this title. So we want this image to actually just be the instructions image. And so let's go to the inspector and go to load, go to sprites, and let's grab that instructions graphic that I made. That looks pretty good. You might in this menu want to change the design a little bit. Maybe we'll take this guy outside of the VBox container. So maybe we'll make the instructions stuck to the center left. And we'll make our VBox container stuck to the center right. And it should resize itself, hopefully. No, it didn't resize itself. Okay, so let's go to the VBox container. And let's reset the size. Okay, that looks better. And then click center right, there we go. So now we can preview that. And we might want to add a little margin in there. So another thing you can do with the main containers is add a little bit of a margin. So if I go into the control structure and go to margin, it's going to default calculate these top and right margins because it's stuck to the center left, but we can give it a left margin, maybe like 64 pixels. And I think it should keep that. Okay. And so then maybe we'll add the same margin on the right to our buttons. Oh, whoops. That didn't do exactly what I wanted, but let's see if it does it right anyway. No, that's not what I wanted. Maybe we do negative. Okay, what happens if I just drag, whoops. What happens if I just drag the whole, okay. Let's make these guys unselectable. And I'm gonna try to drag, oh, okay, it's still selectable. Okay, it's not really letting me do that. What about the rectangle? Okay, I'm not really sure why the VBox container won't let me change the margin like the image would. But that's okay. We'll just leave it as is for now. Let's try it one more time. No, for some reason that doesn't do what I think it should do. We can move it in with the anchor. Okay, that's good enough for now. It's a little tricky using the UI system, and I'm still getting used to some of the components as well. Another thing that we can do now is we don't really need the instructions button anymore since we're on the instructions scene. So I'm just going to go ahead and delete that node. And the VBox should kind of like match it. It might center things when we actually load the scene. Okay, so that looks good enough for our instruction scene. And now what we'll see is that if I actually open my main menu, the code is set up that the instructions should go to our instruction scene. And the buttons already work because we duplicated it, so it kept all those signals set up correctly. So that's how we can make new scenes. If you have like a narrative, you might have a narrative that uses these scenes. So you could actually go from like one to the next slide as setting up some kind of story for your game. Let's make sure the quit button still works. Okay, so that looks pretty good. So that's one way of making UI, is having these separate scenes. The last thing we're gonna do is we're actually gonna add a UI that's inside of the main scene, and we're gonna turn that on using a script. So that's a little bit of a different approach, but it's something that you could actually do with your start scene. You could have the start buttons on overlaid on top of the game itself, you know, instead of using the graphics or something like that. So if you wanted to do that, you could use that approach with all of your scenes. So I'm going to show how to do that now with the in-game. When you die, you'll get a chance to play again or quit. And so just like we did before, let's duplicate our instructions menu to make our in-game game over menu. So I'm going to go to instructions and duplicate, and I'm going to call this game over. And we have to make sure to get the name of this correct in the hierarchy, because it is important for the script. So then what we're actually going to do is we're going to make this game over scene a child of the main scene. And there's a couple other things we have to do there, but for now I'm just going to drag this in. And now you can see there's this control structure, and it's just kind of like overlaid on top of my scene. So we do have to fix a couple things here. Let's change the layout to full rectangle. Oops. So notice when I start this scene now, the GUI stuff is just going to be right there, and it's actually going to move along with everything else in our scene. So depending on what you're making, maybe that would be cool to have the instructions set up like that. But that's not what we want for this case. So one thing I have to do first is I need to make sure to name this game over. If it's not called game over, it's not going to work with the script, although you could modify the script if you wanted to try that. The next thing that we're going to do is, in order to make this not move with the rest of the scene, we're going to add a new canvas layer. That canvas layer is going to ignore our camera. So I'm going to go to main scene, add child node, and add a canvas layer. And click create. and I'm going to put the game over inside of our canvas layer. And I'm going to rename this canvas layer GUI. So that's where we're going to add all of our graphical interface so that it ignores everything else that's happening in our scene. So now that'll stay in the same place along with the character. So it's not, going with the camera. This came up with a couple of people who wanted some of their graphics to stay in one place. A canvas layer is one way to do that. Another way to do that is to parent stuff to the camera. So then we actually have to edit the Gameover scene. Notice that I can't edit inside of Gameover within the main scene. I actually have to go over to the Gameover scene itself. So we're going to change a couple things here. So now the instructions become Gameover. And we have to find the image for that. So I'm going to go to load, go to scripts. Oh, not scripts. Go up. Sprites, find Gameover, click open. Okay, that looks good enough. I'm just going to leave that as is. The quit button we still need, but the start button now needs to be called the play again button. I'm going to look at my script just to make sure that's right. And it actually does the exact same thing as the start button. So, maybe we could leave it the same, but if there were other things that you wanted to reset when you play the game again, then you would need a separate function. So it's a good idea to have that as a separate function already. So let's go back to our scene. Let's name this the play again button. And then we're actually gonna have to reroute this signal to make sure it's right. So let's get the right sprite for this. It's inside game buttons, play again, and open. And then I'm going to go over to my node panel. Right now it's routed to the start button. That's actually fine because right now it's the same thing. But let's actually choose play again button and connect that. And even though it does the exact same thing, it's good to have those separate because we might add different functionality later. So now let's preview the scene and see if this works. Okay, so if I have game over and I click play again, or if I click quit, okay, so that works, that's good. The last little bit, I'm gonna go back to the main scene. I don't actually want this game over there all the time, but it's written into my script that if the player falls too far, then it should turn the game over on. So I'm gonna turn it off by default by just clicking on that little eyeball. And then I'm going to click play and let's test to see if this works. So if I walk over here, well, I can't actually fall through there, but let's go fall over here. So after I fall a certain amount, oh, we got an error. Okay, so if you get this error, that means that it can't find this game over. So let's take a look at the script and see what the problem is. So this is in player. So it's trying to find, oh, I named this something else. Okay, so this should actually be just called UI. Sometimes GUI and UI are kind of interchangeable. So make sure you call the canvas layer the UI rather than GUI. So I forgot what I had named that. So this should work now. He's gonna fall. And so now we see the game over, and it's actually pausing other stuff that's happening in the game. I rewrote the script so that it wouldn't move the player anymore. Not that it really matters because we can't see the player, but just to avoid, any weird stuff that might happen in the physics. So if we click play again, we just appear right back on the screen. And these platforms are actually too close together. I can't fall through them. So I'm gonna have to do a better level design here. But if I fall off, okay, now I have the option to play again or to quit. So that's pretty much everything. You can use different parts of that UI. If you want to put your start scene inside the main scene as well, you could put that in there. One last thing I'm going to do is go to my project, go to the project settings that we looked at before, and I'm actually going to choose my start menu as my main scene. So I'm going to click open. So now the main scene is going to be the start menu. So when you start my game, it's going to open to the start menu. And so if I go to instructions, I can see the instructions and then go here. And if I die, then we can quit. Another thing I might want to do, you can see the name of the game here is still Lab 2 tile map. So I'm going to change this to Lab 3 dash UI. And or actually, this is more of like a start menu lab. And I'm going to save that and close. And so that's pretty much everything. One thing to mention just, again, is that if you do want to change the color of the buttons, you can do that. You could do it with code, actually, to do different stuff, but you could also go in here, go to visibility, change this by layer for the whole thing, or you can go to specific buttons and go down to, where is it? Visibility. I might be covering it up, and change just individual buttons. So one of the reasons I'm using the white and black art is so that I can change the color programmatically using the editor, but you don't have to do that. You can make the art look however you want. Just wanted to kind of remind you guys of that option. So yeah, that's basically it for this video. I'll point out a couple things in the code just so you guys can see what that looks like, but you don't have to change anything here. So feel free to skip this part if you want. So a couple things that we have in these scripts now. You can see all of the button presses here. I think I basically already explained this, but you can see how to add one of those. If you actually want to add a new button that has a different functionality, and you want to add that to the script, when you go to the node and double click pressed, you can actually write a new method here, and it's going to throw it into your code for you. So it's actually going to write out that code for you. So that's a nice feature of Godot. It's going to actually copy this basically right into here, and then you can change the code. And I already talked about the quit button. So that's all of the GUI stuff. In the player, I added a couple of things in here. You can see it's getting a reference to the Gameover menu. You're going to get an error if you don't have that Gameover menu, so you might want to take that out. I actually have a function here that prints Gameover just to, I guess I was testing. You don't really need this. You could go ahead and delete that if you wanted. But then because the game can end now, I added a little is alive component to the player. And so by default, the player is alive. And if the player is alive, it's going to call the update, which is where all that player code is now. Down here at the bottom, if the position of the player is 2 times higher than the size of the screen, then the game over is going to pop up and the player alive is going to go to false. And the reason I did 2 times is, again, because you want to do it relative to the screen size, and you don't also want to have it happen immediately, because you have to let the player see that their avatar has actually fallen off before that game over scene comes up. So you don't want it to happen immediately afterwards. So that was kind of the decision there. And yeah, that's pretty much it as far as new code for this lesson. So that's basically everything. And if you have any questions, let me know on Discord and we can go over it. And yeah, I'll see you guys in class.